November 14, 1944. The Junkers Aircraft Facility, outside Dessau, Germany. A gray military transport truck rumbled through the main gates of the sprawling industrial complex, its cargo wrapped in heavy canvas tarps and secured with thick chains. Word had spread quickly through the engineering department that morning. The Luftwaffe had recovered something extraordinary from a crash site near the Polish border, something that could change everything. As the truck backed into Hangar 7, a crowd of engineers, technicians, and military officials gathered in the cold morning air, their breath forming small clouds in the autumn chill. Among them stood some of Germany's finest aeronautical minds, men who had designed the Messerschmitt 109, the Focke-Wulf 190, and the revolutionary Messerschmitt 262 jet fighter. They had spent years pushing the boundaries of aviation technology, believing that German engineering represented the pinnacle of human achievement. The hangar doors closed behind the truck with a heavy metallic groan, and guards took positions at every entrance. What happened next would be classified at the highest levels. No photographs, no unauthorized notes, no casual conversations about what they were about to see. The head of the facility, Oberst Heinrich Vogel, stepped forward as workers began unwrapping the cargo. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced in crisp German, "before you is the heart of the American B-29 Superfortress. One of their bombers went down during a reconnaissance mission, and we managed to recover this engine before it could be completely destroyed. This is your opportunity to understand how the Americans have achieved such remarkable range and payload capacity." As the canvas fell away, revealing the massive radial engine beneath, a collective intake of breath rippled through the assembled crowd. Even partially damaged from the crash, the Wright R3003 150 duplex Cyclone was magnificent. Its 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows gleamed even in the dim hangar light, and its sheer size dwarfed the German engines most of them had worked with. This was the power plant that allowed American bombers to strike deep into German territory and return safely to bases in England or Italy, carrying bomb loads that seemed impossible by German standards. Among the engineers pressing forward for a closer look was a man whose life was about to change forever, though he didn't know it yet. His name was Ernst Mueller, and he had spent 23 years designing aircraft engines for the German aviation industry. He had started as an apprentice in 1921, worked his way through the technical ranks, and now served as the chief propulsion engineer at the Junkers facility. Ernst was 45 years old, methodical, precise, and utterly convinced that German engineering could match or exceed anything the Allies produced. As he approached the captured engine, running his experienced hands along its cooling fins and examining its construction, he felt a familiar surge of confidence. They would measure it, analyze it, understand it, and then Germany would build something better. Ernst Mueller had never doubted Germany's technological superiority, not once in his entire career. He had witnessed the birth of modern aviation, watched as German engineers revolutionized aircraft design, and personally contributed to engines that powered some of the fastest fighters in the world. His office walls displayed certificates from the Reich Air Ministry, commendations for innovation, and photographs of aircraft that bore his technical signature. He had shaken hands with Ernst Heinkel, corresponded with Willy Messerschmitt, and once spent an afternoon discussing turbine theory with the legendary Hans von Ohain. These were not mere engineers, they were artists of metal and mathematics, men who transformed dreams of flight into thundering reality. The morning after the B-29 engine arrived, Ernst assembled his core team in the facility's secure analysis room. He had hand-picked these men over the years, choosing them not just for their technical brilliance, but for their dedication to German excellence. There was Josef Kessler, his senior thermodynamics specialist, a thin, intense man of 38 who could calculate fuel efficiency ratios in his head faster than most men could write them down. Beside him sat Wilhelm Brandt, the metallurgist whose understanding of alloys and stress tolerances had improved German engine durability by nearly 20% over the past 3 years. The youngest member, Friedrich Holzmann, was only 26, but possessed an almost supernatural ability to read blueprints and understand mechanical relationships that others missed. Ernst stood before them, his hands clasped behind his back in the military posture that years of working with Luftwaffe officials had ingrained in him. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the confidence of 2 decades of success, "we have been given an extraordinary opportunity. The Americans have been bombing our cities with apparent impunity, flying missions that our own bombers cannot match in range or payload. Today, we begin to understand why, and more importantly, how we can counter it." He gestured toward the adjacent hangar, where the captured engine waited under guard. "That machine represents their advantage. But advantages can be measured, understood, and overcome. That is what German engineering does. That is what we do." The men nodded, sharing his certainty. They had all experienced the frustration of watching American bomber formations appear in German skies, seemingly invulnerable to the fuel and range limitations that constrained German aircraft. But they had also seen German innovation triumph before. The jet engine had been a German invention. German rockets were flying when other nations still relied on conventional artillery. If the Americans had achieved something remarkable, it was only a matter of time before German engineers matched and surpassed it. Ernst distributed assignments for the initial analysis. Joseph would focus on the thermodynamic efficiency and fuel consumption patterns. Wilhelm would examine the metallurgy and manufacturing techniques. Friedrich would create detailed technical drawings of every component, measuring tolerances to the smallest fraction of a millimeter. As the meeting concluded and his team headed toward the hangar, Ernst remained in the analysis room for a moment, looking out the window at the factory floor below. He thought about his 2 sons, both serving in the Wehrmacht, and his daughter working in a communications office in Berlin. The initial examination began at 0800 hours on November 15th. Ernst and his team approached the B-29 engine with the systematic precision that defined German technical culture. They had prepared measurement instruments, calibrated to exacting standards, and established protocols for documenting every observation. The engine sat on a reinforced examination platform, surrounded by portable lighting that cast harsh shadows across its damaged but still impressive form. Ernst had seen countless engines in his career, but standing before this American machine, he felt something unexpected. Not admiration exactly, but a strange sense of anticipation mixed with unease. Friedrich began with the external measurements, using precision calipers and gauges to record dimensions. His pencil moved rapidly across gridded paper, creating technical drawings with the skill of an artist. The engine's diameter exceeded their initial estimates. Ernst watched as Friedrich's confident expression slowly shifted to confusion, then to something approaching disbelief. "Herr Mueller," Friedrich said quietly, "the tolerances on these cylinder walls are—" He paused, checking his measurements again. "They're holding to within 0.02 of a millimeter, consistently. Across all 18 cylinders." Ernst frowned. That level of precision was theoretically possible, but achieving it consistently in mass production seemed impossible. German factories, even with their vaunted engineering standards, typically worked to tolerances of 5 to 8 thousandths of a millimeter. Tighter tolerances meant better engine performance, but they also meant dramatically more complex and expensive manufacturing processes. "Check again," Ernst instructed, keeping his voice neutral. Friedrich did, using 3 different measuring instruments. The results remained the same. Wilhelm had moved to examining the engine's internal components, carefully disassembling sections that the crash hadn't destroyed. What he discovered next deepened the growing sense of unease. The crankshaft alone weighed more than some entire German aircraft engines, yet it showed evidence of precision balancing that exceeded anything Wilhelm had encountered. He ran his fingers along the surface, feeling for the microscopic irregularities that inevitably appeared in metal casting and machining. He found almost none. "This isn't just precision engineering," Wilhelm said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is precision manufacturing at scale. The Americans aren't building these one at a time in specialized workshops. They're producing them in quantities large enough to power hundreds of bombers." Joseph had begun his thermodynamic analysis, examining the fuel injection system and combustion chamber design. His calculations started confidently, but as he worked through the mathematics, his pencil movements became slower, more deliberate. He checked his figures twice, then 3 times. Ernst noticed the metallurgist had gone pale. "Joseph," Ernst called out. "What have you found?" Joseph looked up, and Ernst saw something in his colleague's eyes that sent a chill through him. It wasn't confusion or surprise. It was fear. "Herr Mueller," Joseph said carefully, "if these measurements are correct, and if my calculations are accurate, this engine achieves a fuel efficiency rating approximately 40% better than our best designs." Ernst felt the floor seem to shift slightly beneath his feet. 40% wasn't just an improvement, it was a revolution. Ernst spent that entire night in his office, surrounded by Joseph's calculations and Friedrich's technical drawings. The numbers refused to cooperate with his expectations, no matter how many times he reworked the equations. He had sent his team home at 2200 hours, telling them to rest and return fresh in the morning. But Ernst couldn't rest. The implications of what they were discovering kept him awake, hunched over his desk with cold coffee and cigarette smoke filling the room. The mathematics were brutally simple once you accepted the initial premises. If the B-29 engine truly achieved 40% better fuel efficiency than comparable German designs, and if it could maintain that efficiency while producing significantly more horsepower, then the strategic implications were catastrophic. Ernst pulled out a map of Europe and began calculating ranges. A B-29 could carry approximately 9,000 kilograms of bombs. Using the fuel efficiency numbers Joseph had calculated, these aircraft could strike targets deep in Germany, then return to bases in England without refueling. German bombers, by contrast, could barely reach London with meaningful payload capacity, and returning safely was never guaranteed. The numbers grew worse as Ernst continued. American production capacity meant they could build these engines, and the bombers they powered, in quantities that Germany couldn't hope to match. Even if German engineers developed comparable technology tomorrow, the industrial infrastructure to manufacture it simply didn't exist anymore. Allied bombing had seen to that. The factories that could produce precision components, to the tolerances required, were being destroyed faster than they could be rebuilt. Ernst rose from his desk and walked to the window, looking out at the darkened facility. In the distance, he could see the glow of fires from a city that had been bombed 3 days earlier. Those fires had been started by American bombers, powered by engines like the one sitting in Hangar 7. He thought about the propaganda he had believed, the assurances from leadership that German technology would prevail, that wonder weapons were coming that would turn the tide of war. But wonder weapons required resources, time, and industrial capacity. The Americans already had their wonder weapon. It was mass production at a scale and precision that Germany could no longer match. The realization settled over Ernst like a heavy blanket. This wasn't just about one engine or one aircraft design. This was about an entire industrial philosophy, an approach to manufacturing that combined precision with quantity in ways that German engineering culture had never prioritized. When Joseph arrived the next morning, he found Ernst still at his desk, the calculations spread before him like evidence in a criminal trial. Joseph's expression suggested he had spent a similarly sleepless night, reaching similar conclusions. They didn't need to speak immediately. The understanding passed between them in silence. Joseph finally broke the quiet. "I've checked everything 3 times, Herr Mueller. The mathematics don't lie." Ernst nodded slowly, crushing out another cigarette in the overflowing ashtray. "No," he said quietly, "they never do. The question is what we do with this truth." That question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that extended far beyond engineering. The analysis continued for 2 more weeks, but the initial conclusions only deepened with further examination. Each new measurement, each calculation, each comparison with German equivalents revealed the same uncomfortable truth. The technological gap wasn't something that could be closed with clever engineering or innovative design. It was structural, rooted in manufacturing capabilities and resource access that Germany no longer possessed. Ernst watched his team's confidence erode day by day, replaced by a quiet desperation that no one dared voice openly. The facility remained under tight security, but Ernst knew that secrets had a way of spreading despite precautions. Other engineers had heard rumors about the captured engine, and some had found reasons to visit Hangar 7, hoping for glimpses of what Ernst's team was examining. Friedrich was the first to break the unspoken rule about discussing the broader implications. It happened during a late evening session, when only Ernst, Joseph, and Wilhelm remained in the analysis room. Friedrich had been unusually quiet all day, his normally animated face drawn and troubled. He set down his calipers with deliberate care and looked directly at Ernst. "Herr Mueller," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "if we cannot match this technology, and if the Americans can produce these engines in the quantities we believe they can, then how can we possibly," he paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound like defeatism, "how can we defend against them?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Wilhelm looked up sharply from his metallurgical samples, his eyes warning Friedrich to be careful. Joseph remained motionless, but Ernst could see the younger man's words had struck something Joseph had been thinking but hadn't dared say. Ernst chose his words carefully. They were alone, but walls had ears, and expressing doubt about Germany's ultimate victory could be construed as defeatism or worse. "We focus on what we can control," Ernst said firmly. "Our task is to provide accurate technical analysis, not to make strategic assessments. That responsibility belongs to others." But his words sounded hollow even to himself, and he could see that his team wasn't convinced. Wilhelm spoke up, his voice tight with barely suppressed emotion. "My brother writes from the Eastern Front. He says they're retreating, that supplies aren't arriving, that promised reinforcements never materialize. And now we discover that the Americans have this level of technological advantage." He gestured at the engine specifications spread across their work table. "What are we even doing here? What difference does our analysis make?" Ernst felt the weight of command, the responsibility of maintaining morale while confronting truths that undermined everything they had believed. He had spent his entire career in service to German aviation, had raised his children to be proud of their country's technical achievements, had assured his sons that German engineering excellence would secure victory. Now he stood before men who looked to him for leadership, and he had no reassuring answers to offer. The silence stretched between them until Joseph finally spoke. "We continue because we're engineers," he said quietly. "We serve the truth, even when the truth is difficult." December brought the coldest weather Ernst could remember in years, and with it, a discovery that made all their previous concerns seem almost trivial. Wilhelm had been conducting detailed metallurgical analysis of the engine's components, using the facility's spectrographic equipment to determine the exact composition of the alloys the Americans were using. What he found wasn't just impressive engineering, it was material science that seemed to come from a different world entirely. The aluminum alloys used throughout the B-29 engine represented a level of refinement and quality that German metallurgists had theorized about but never successfully produced at scale. Wilhelm spent 3 days analyzing samples from different components, hoping his initial findings were errors. They weren't. Every piece he examined showed the same extraordinary properties. Ernst stood beside Wilhelm in the metallurgy laboratory, watching as the spectrograph produced its analysis of yet another sample. The machine hummed quietly, its display showing the precise elemental composition of the American aluminum alloy. Wilhelm pointed to the readings with a pencil, his hand trembling slightly. "Look at the purity levels, Herr Mueller. The contamination from iron and silicon is almost negligible, and the magnesium content is precisely controlled to within 0.02%. Do you understand what that means?" Ernst did understand, though he wished he didn't. Aluminum alloy quality determined strength-to-weight ratios, heat resistance, and structural reliability. The Americans weren't just using better alloys. They were using alloys that required refining processes and quality control mechanisms that Germany's depleted industrial infrastructure could no longer support. Joseph joined them, carrying a thick folder of calculations he had been working on. His face looked gaunt from too many late nights and too much coffee. "I've been analyzing the material requirements for producing a comparable engine," he said, without preamble. Even if we could match the design and precision manufacturing, even if we had the tools and the expertise, we would need approximately 2,300 kilograms of this grade aluminum per engine. Ernst felt something cold settle in his chest. How much of this quality aluminum is Germany currently producing monthly? Joseph's expression provided the answer before he spoke. Our current production of comparable grade aluminum is approximately 14,000 kilograms monthly, total, for all applications, military and civilian combined. And that number is decreasing as bauxite supplies from occupied territories become less reliable. The implications cascaded through Ernst's mind, like dominoes falling. If Germany produced 14,000 kilograms monthly, and each engine required 2,300 kilograms, they could theoretically manufacture 6 engines per month. 6 engines, when the Americans were producing hundreds, perhaps thousands. And that assumed dedicating all high-grade aluminum production solely to engine manufacturing, leaving none for airframes, none for other critical applications, none for the countless military needs that demanded quality aluminum alloys. Wilhelm had pulled out additional reports, documents that Ernst recognized as classified industrial production assessments. He shouldn't have access to these files, but Ernst didn't question how he had obtained them. "We've lost the bauxite mines in Hungary," Wilhelm said quietly. "The refineries in Silesia are operating at 30% capacity due to bombing and fuel shortages. And even when we can produce quality aluminum, transporting it to manufacturing facilities has become increasingly difficult." Ernst sat alone in his office on the evening of December 18th, a blank report form before him. The Reich Air Ministry had requested his preliminary assessment of the captured B-29 engine, expecting the kind of confident analysis that German technical reports typically provided. They wanted reassurance that German engineering could match or exceed American capabilities, that the gap could be closed with proper resources and determination. Ernst had spent 23 years writing reports that celebrated German technical superiority. Tonight, he would write something very different. His pen hovered over the paper for nearly an hour before he finally began. The words came slowly at first, each sentence feeling like a betrayal of everything he had built his career upon. But accuracy demanded honesty, and Ernst had always believed that engineering truth transcended politics or ideology. The captured Wright R-3350 engine represents a level of manufacturing precision and material science that exceeds current German capabilities, he wrote. The fuel efficiency, power output, and reliability of this design cannot be replicated with existing German industrial infrastructure. He paused, reading what he had written. The words looked stark and final on the page, like a diagnosis of terminal illness. But they were true, and Ernst had never lied in a technical report. He continued writing, documenting the specific findings that supported his conclusion. The precision tolerances achieved in mass production, the quality of aluminum alloys, the sophistication of the fuel injection systems, the thermodynamic efficiency that his team had measured and verified repeatedly. Each technical detail built toward an inescapable conclusion. Ernst described the material requirements, the manufacturing capabilities necessary to produce comparable engines, and the current state of German industrial capacity. He included Joseph's calculations about aluminum production, Wilhelm's metallurgical analysis, and Friedrich's precision measurements. The report grew longer as Ernst transcribed weeks of findings into clear, irrefutable technical language. Then came the section he had been dreading. Recommendations. What could he possibly recommend? That Germany abandon hope of matching American bomber capabilities? That resources be redirected from aircraft production to other defensive measures? That the leadership accept the reality of technological and industrial inferiority? Ernst's hand cramped from writing, but he forced himself to continue. Based on these findings, this engineer must conclude that achieving parity with American strategic bombing capabilities is not feasible with current resources. The industrial infrastructure, material supplies, and manufacturing precision required exceed what can be accomplished within any realistic time frame. He set down his pen and read through the completed report. 15 pages of technical analysis that effectively declared Germany's air war already lost. Ernst thought about his sons at the front, his daughter in Berlin, all the families across Germany who believed that superior technology and determination would somehow deliver victory. He thought about the propaganda that promised wonder weapons and inevitable triumph. Then he thought about the mathematics, the measurements, the undeniable physical reality documented in his report. Engineers served truth, Joseph had said. Ernst sealed the report in an envelope marked for immediate delivery to the Reich Air Ministry. His hands shook slightly as he wrote the classification markings. Somewhere in his mind, he knew this report would likely be filed away, ignored, or suppressed. The days following Ernst's report submission were marked by a strange tension that settled over the analysis team like fog. They continued their work, documenting additional findings and preparing supplementary technical analyses, but the atmosphere had shifted. The initial excitement of examining captured enemy technology had been replaced by something heavier, a shared understanding that they had crossed an invisible threshold from which there was no return. They had seen behind the curtain of propaganda and discovered that the machinery of war was grinding toward an inevitable conclusion. Friedrich was the first to voice what they were all thinking, though he chose his moment carefully. It was late evening, past 2200 hours, when most of the facility staff had gone home. Only Ernst's core team remained in the analysis room, ostensibly finishing documentation, but mostly avoiding their empty apartments and the questions from wives and families they couldn't safely answer. "My cousin works in the communications ministry," Friedrich said suddenly, breaking the silence. "He processes casualty reports. The numbers they release publicly," he paused, looking around to ensure they were truly alone. "They're not the real numbers." Wilhelm looked up sharply. "That's dangerous talk, Friedrich. We could all be reported for even listening to such things." Friedrich's laugh was bitter and short. "Reported to whom? The Gestapo? For knowing what anyone with eyes can see? My brother-in-law returned from the Eastern Front last month, missing his left arm. He says entire divisions are being destroyed, that retreat is constant now, and we sit here analyzing an engine that proves the Americans can bomb our cities at will while we can barely keep our own aircraft fueled." Joseph had been silent, staring at the technical drawings spread across his desk. Now he spoke without looking up. "My wife asked me last week if we should send our daughter to her sister's farm in Bavaria, away from the cities, away from the bombing. I told her yes. I told her to go this week." Ernst felt the weight of leadership pressing down on him. These men were looking to him not just for technical guidance, but for some kind of moral direction in a situation that grew more impossible daily. He had always maintained professional distance, kept his personal doubts separate from his engineering work, but that separation had become impossible to sustain. "When I was young," Ernst said quietly, "I believed that engineering was pure, that mathematics and physics existed above politics and ideology, that if we built things well enough, precisely enough, we could solve any problem." He gestured at the documentation of the B-29 engine surrounding them. "This machine has taught me something different. Superior engineering comes from superior industrial systems, and those systems require resources, stability, and long-term planning. We've been burning through all three for years now." Wilhelm stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkened facility grounds. "The question none of us can say out loud," he said, "is what happens to us when this ends, when Germany loses." Ernst didn't correct Wilhelm's phrasing. When, not if. That shift in language told him everything about how completely their analysis had changed their understanding of Germany's prospects. Friedrich spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. 3 weeks passed before Ernst received any response to his technical report. The silence itself was telling. In the past, comprehensive analyses of captured enemy equipment typically generated immediate responses from the Air Ministry, requests for clarification, demands for additional testing, or orders to begin development of countermeasures. Ernst's report about the B-29 engine generated none of these. It simply disappeared into the bureaucratic machinery of a regime that had stopped listening to uncomfortable truths. When the response finally came, it arrived not through official channels, but through a phone call from an old colleague, Dieter Krauss, who worked in the Technical Assessment Division in Berlin. Ernst recognized the careful neutrality in Dieter's voice immediately, the kind of studied casualness that meant the conversation was being monitored or recorded. "Your recent submission has been reviewed," Dieter said, his words formal and precise. "The assessment team appreciates the thoroughness of your technical analysis. However, the conclusion section has been deemed unnecessarily pessimistic and not aligned with current strategic planning assumptions." Ernst felt something cold settle in his stomach. He had expected his report might be challenged or questioned, but outright rejection based on alignment with strategic assumptions rather than technical accuracy was something different entirely. "I stand by my findings," Ernst replied carefully. "The measurements and calculations are verifiable. Any competent engineer would reach similar conclusions based on the available data." Dieter's pause was lengthy enough to be meaningful. "Of course, Herr Mueller. No one questions your technical competence. However, the decision has been made to classify your report at a restricted level and limit its distribution. Your team is instructed to continue documentation of the captured engine but to refrain from strategic assessments in future submissions." After the call ended, Ernst sat motionless at his desk, the telephone receiver still warm in his hand. 23 years of technical service and his most important analysis would be filed away and forgotten because it contradicted the narrative that leadership wanted to maintain. He thought about all the engineers across Germany, talented men producing accurate assessments that were being systematically ignored because they didn't support increasingly fantastical claims about wonder weapons and inevitable victory. That evening, Ernst gathered his team and delivered the news. He watched their faces as they processed what his sanitized explanation really meant. Their work would continue, but it wouldn't matter. The technical truth they had discovered would be buried beneath layers of classification and willful ignorance. Joseph's reaction was the most visceral. He swept his arm across his desk, sending calculations and drawings scattering across the floor. "What's the point?" he demanded, his voice rising with frustration. "What's the point of any of this if accurate analysis is dismissed because it's inconvenient?" Ernst had no good answer. Wilhelm picked up the scattered papers methodically, his movements slow and deliberate. "We continue because we're engineers," he said, echoing Joseph's words from weeks earlier, but his voice lacked conviction now. They all understood what had happened. The regime had chosen comforting lies over uncomfortable truths, and engineers who served accuracy rather than ideology had become irrelevant. Friedrich was the youngest, and perhaps that made him the most disillusioned. "I joined this profession because I believed in building things," he said quietly. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. Ernst Mueller stood in the ruins of the Junkers facility, watching American soldiers establish control over what remained of the complex. Allied bombing had destroyed most of the hangars and workshops during the final months of the war, but Hangar 7, where they had examined the B-29 engine, remained partially intact. The engine itself was long gone, evacuated somewhere during the chaotic final weeks, though Ernst had no idea where. It didn't matter anymore. The war he had known was ending, and an entirely different future was beginning. The American technical intelligence officer who interviewed him spoke surprisingly good German. Captain Robert Chen introduced himself and explained that the United States was interested in identifying German engineers with specialized knowledge, particularly those who had worked on advanced aviation projects. Ernst found himself describing the months he had spent analyzing the captured B-29 engine, explaining how his team had documented American manufacturing superiority with methodical precision. Captain Chen listened carefully, occasionally making notes. "Your report," he said, "the one you submitted in December about the engine analysis. We found a copy in the Air Ministry archives." Ernst felt a strange mixture of vindication and sadness. "So, someone read it after all," he said. Chen's expression was difficult to read. "It was one of the most honest assessments we've found in German military documents. Most of your colleagues were still claiming technological parity, even as their factories were being bombed to rubble. You told the truth, even when it was dangerous to do so." That kind of intellectual honesty is exactly what American aerospace programs need. The offer came 2 weeks later, processed through channels that Ernst barely understood. The United States was recruiting German engineers and scientists as part of what they were calling Operation Paperclip. He would be given the opportunity to emigrate to America, to work on the next generation of aircraft engines, to apply his knowledge in service of the very technology that had defeated his country. Ernst thought about his sons. One had died in Russia, frozen in a retreat that should never have been ordered. The other had survived, but returned home hollow and silent, carrying wounds that went deeper than the shrapnel scars on his legs. He thought about his daughter, working now to clear rubble from Berlin's streets, trying to survive in a city that had become a landscape of destruction. He thought about Joseph, Wilhelm, and Friedrich, scattered now to uncertain fates in a country that no longer existed as they had known it. The decision should have been surprisingly simple. Germany had ignored his truth. America, at least, had read his report and valued accuracy over ideology. In August of 1945, Ernst Mueller boarded a ship bound for the United States. He carried with him a single leather briefcase containing his personal technical notes, including the original calculations from the B-29 engine analysis. 20 years later, Ernst stood in an American aircraft factory in Seattle, watching precision engines roll off production lines. He had helped design them, combining German engineering discipline with American manufacturing philosophy. His daughter had joined him in America, married an American engineer, and raised children who spoke English as their first language. Ernst never forgot examining that captured engine in late 1944, when mathematics forced him to abandon comfortable lies. He often told younger engineers about those months when a single engine revealed not just technological gaps, but fundamental truths about societies that face reality versus those that deny it. The story became a quiet footnote in history, but for those who understood aerospace engineering, it represented something profound. Technical truth transcended nationalism. The B-29 engine had taught Ernst that superior technology emerged from superior systems and honesty. From the ashes of one belief, he built new understanding, carrying forward the lesson that the best engineering cannot overcome a society's refusal to face truth.